Welcome to Public Forum, a community outreach program produced at North Idaho College on the shores of Lake Coeur d'Alene. Featuring guests from around the globe addressing a wide variety of subjects, Public Forum serves to educate and enlighten. Please join host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart, in welcoming today's guest.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Last week in part one, we dealt with the topic, the horrors of the Holocaust, and we're continuing that with part two in this two-week series. It's such an incredibly dark history and story, but something that's very important to know about, and the more you know about history, the more likely it's not to be repeated. Our distinguished guest is Bill Prosher. He holds a BA degree in English from Pacific University. He has a master's in English from Arizona State University and a second master's degree in administration from the University of Idaho, and he holds the degree in the field of a PhD in the field of educational leadership. Bill, welcome back. Last week was just so informative, and we thank you for taking this time with us.
My pleasure.
And as always, I'm pleased to have regular panelist Janelle Burke, and she is an attorney in the state of Idaho and has been on this program for, I think it's 33 or 34 years now. You've been very dedicated, and we thank you so much.
You're welcome.
And we will start the questioning with our panelist Janelle Burke.
Thank you, Bill, for coming back to be with us today. I would like to ask you about the second step in your 4 steps that you said occurred during the Holocaust. Mm-hmm. On last week's program, you outlined 4 steps. The first was identification. The second was expropriation, which is basically the passing of laws. The third step then was to move Jews into the ghettos, and the fourth step was the annihilation. Mm-hmm. Let's go back to the second step and talk in more detail about the expropriation, which basically is the passing of laws that eventually took away civil rights. Can you explain that in more detail, please?
Sure. Once the victim population, the Jews, are identified, then that separation comes, as you mentioned, through the use of law. And all of a sudden, a Jew is not allowed to practice medicine or teach at the university level. And it got down to a Jew couldn't sit on a public bench, could not be seen talking with an Aryan woman or dating, certainly, an Aryan woman.
Could not use a telephone.
Right. So the law was used against them to further separate and separate and separate and marginalize the Jews, as well as taking any means of defense, any monetary means that could be used to bribe other officials or get food supplies and so on. So it's reducing them to an absolutely dependent state. And once that happens, then in the case of a ghetto, a Judenrat was formed, a Jewish council of prominent Jews who the rest of the Jews would look up to and accept their leadership. And then that was manipulated by the Nazi leadership, so that they really didn't have to do much work themselves. They got the Jews to police themselves, burial squads, sanitation squads, all the necessary functions of the ghetto. But that expropriation meant removing every possible means of making a living and then defending themselves.
Outside the ghetto, of course.
Outside the ghetto.
And when you're talking about this removal of civil rights, it didn't happen all at once.
No.
It happened as a step-by-step kind of thing.
Right.
So for the lessons to be learned for today, it's important to be watching, because this was all done under the color of law.
It certainly was. And as you point out, it's a very gradual, well-thought-out process. And we know at times that Hitler paused. He would take a step and pause to hear, I want to know what the reaction of the church is, or what did the Pope say? And finally, he found, he realized that no one was going to do anything. And he felt completely free then. And that famous comment he made, who today remembers the Armenians? The Armenian massacre occurred before World War II and World War I, and Hitler was very aware of that. And even when people would object and say, well, you better watch out for the religious reaction, he would say things like, well, how many divisions does the Pope have? And make his point that way. So once those lawful safeguards were removed, then you have that very dangerous situation where the authorities can do anything.
I know it's such a very difficult sub-issue to bring up, but you've done a lot of research on the fact that in the mass killing that they discovered in this plan they had that one method wasn't enough to kill as many people as they wanted to per day or per week. Share some of how they went about.
It was a very difficult logistical problem to not only kill these people, but then deal with the bodies. And so methods were tried. Trial and error method was used. In one case, the exhaust pipe of a hermetically sealed van was piped back into the van, and Jews were driven around until they were all asphyxiated. However, they quickly calculated that they didn't have enough gas for that to be a viable method of killing so many people so quickly. They also experimented with lining Jews up and trying to pass one bullet through as many skulls as possible, and had various experiments like that of how to kill these people. And they finally settled, in the case of the death camps, on gassing with prussic acid. And so, but that was a long, painful process of finding out just how quickly and efficiently to kill the Jews. So,
it just, again, we said last week, it's beyond comprehension. Another issue that we ended with last time, and Janelle mentioned it this time, there's really a prominent writer who talked about defining civil rights in a context different than we often think of because of these kinds of acts.
Right. Unfortunately, the scholar's name is Hannah Arendt, and she wrote a book called The Origins of Totalitarianism, where she makes the case that human rights really only exist if you belong to a community that can defend them. And in the case of the Nazis and the Jews, unfortunately, what it proves is that human rights in the abstract really are meaningless. They have to be actual, have to be defended, and sometimes by force. We have the example of Heinrich Himmler, who was essentially a god to the Nazis, and they swore allegiance to him personally, that they would always carry out his order without question. Towards the end of the war, when both the Russians and the American armies were forcing them to move Jews out of the camps and walk them around in what was known as the death marches, Himmler was trying to surrender to the Americans as opposed to the Russians for obvious reasons. The Russians would have shot him, but the Americans tended to be much more lenient. So in trying to do that, he issued an order to stop killing the Jews, which normally would be immediately obeyed by all members of the SS. What we know now is that the SS actually refused that order and continued to kill Jews until the rifles were physically removed from their hands by American or Russian soldiers.
I do want to go on another angle here too. There were some very brave individuals who resisted
Indeed.
the dictatorship and overcame their fear. And tell us a little bit about some very brave heroes who helped protect Jewish people and hide them at their own risk. And of course, probably the person that saved more lives than any one individual was Raoul Wallenberg, who was from Sweden, I believe, as a diplomat, and he would fake passports, and he's credited for saving 100,000 people's lives.
Yes.
So let's share a little bit about some of the heroes.
I'd be glad to. Raoul Wallenberg is greatly honored. The museum sits on Raoul Wallenberg Place in his honor. And one of the people I've been fortunate enough to meet is a woman named Vladka Mead, who was a 16 or 17-year-old girl in the Warsaw Ghetto, who went through these experiences. Her brother was so starved by the end of the occupation of the ghetto that he simply reported voluntarily to the train station for a loaf of bread. And she remembers her mother going without her bread and saving it up to pay the rabbi to teach her little brother religious lessons because she had no money to pay him. So she paid him in bread, and she remembers going home one day and her whole family just gone, disappeared. She had no idea where they had gone. Later she found out they were killed in Treblinka. They were transported to Treblinka and murdered there. But one of the interesting facts that we now know is that at no time did Treblinka have any more than 16 actual Nazis. And most of the work was done by other groups, volunteers, and so on. So there's no lack of volunteers to kill the Jews wherever they went, in Latvia and Lithuania and Russia and all over Europe.
So there are a lot of guilty people that participated.
Oh, yes. Undoubted.
Janelle Burke.
You've had a number of discussions with survivors, and that came about because of a special program that you were in. But tell us about the stories of some of those survivors who were able to survive and are very brave individuals, and how they feel today. Do they harbor resentment and so forth?
Some do, some don't. Some cannot talk about it. Some can talk freely about it. Some people lost their faith. Some people found their faith. So there's no general answer to your question. But I can tell you about a number of remarkable individuals I met. One was particularly striking, was a woman who told me that when she arrived at Auschwitz, if you remember Dr. Mengele, one of the doctors involved in experimenting, one of his interests was twins. And she was pregnant when she reached the actual point where Mengele would point left or right, and it meant the ovens, the gas chamber and then the ovens, or working. And normally pregnant women were immediately thought too weak to work and immediately gassed. In this case, Mengele ordered her to the camp hospital in Auschwitz, and she delivered a child. But what she didn't know at the time is that the child was essentially a medical experiment, that doctors would come every day with a white coat and a clipboard checking, and her breasts were taped so that she couldn't feed the infant. And the gradual deterioration of the infant's condition was meticulously recorded in a lab book. And so she would be there, in agony about not being able to feed this child, and the child would not be able to hold its head up, or some new horror. And she finally said, and she looked directly in my eyes when she said this, "A kind nurse gave me a syringe full of strychnine, and she injected it into the heart of her own baby and killed it." But that word "kind," by somebody giving you a needle full of poison, tells me that the Holocaust, the regular words just don't fit. We're in a new realm here.
You have with you in your notes, among other things, so much of it's in your mind without the notes, but you have 21 points that you've listed here. We started to talk a little bit into the last show. Would you share some of these key points with us concerning what you've learned? And you've been in seminars and you've visited with the survivors, and your doctor's degree is in the field. So
one of the points that they wanted me to stress was that the Jews did resist. And the story that one man told me, his name was Joseph, I don't know how to pronounce his last name, Bukiet, but he was in Auschwitz. And if you don't know, there are 3 actual Auschwitz, Birkenau, Auschwitz I, and Buna, where they were trying to make synthetic rubber. Well, everything was done at a double time, at a run. And the morning that he told me about, it was very foggy, and they were unloading a trainload of lime to put over dead bodies. And the lime was in 80-pound sacks. And so these starving men would go to the railroad car, take a sack, and run with it, to the place where they were taking it. Well, his job was to come behind anybody who slipped and fell and broke the sack and scoop it up with a shovel. A capo was somebody who was in charge of a barracks of prisoners. And his capo was particularly bloodthirsty, known all over the camp. And he used to boast that he killed 15 Jews before breakfast every day. And he killed them by having them lay on the ground, and he had a stick that he would put over their throat. Then he would put one foot on one side and one foot on the other and rock back and forth until the neck snapped. And so he was just murderous, and this man, Joseph, had dropped his sack right in front of him. And he heard this voice coming at him that he knew was the capo, and he thought his time was up. And he said it was just a natural reaction, but he took his shovel, turned around and brought it down with all of his strength on the capo's head, split his skull, but didn't kill him. The capo recovered after several months, but he could not remember who had actually struck him, and thus this man survived and lived to tell me about it. And he wanted me to make sure I instructed my students that the Jews did resist. And one of the things, unfortunately, that they learned was that there are worse things than death. And so the Nazis were expert at torture, and so if your actions were going to cause the death of 10 others, which the Nazis often used as a tactic to keep people from escaping, to keep people in line and in order, then you had to be very careful about making that decision, because it meant 10 other innocent people would suffer these ungodly tortures as a result of your escape, your resistance, your whatever. So that was one thing, one factor that kept the resistance down. But they wanted me to tell my students, not only was there all kinds of resistance, but it usually came from the young people. Folks our age didn't do that. But in the case of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, Vladka Mead told me that one of her classmates had to go up and study his chemistry book to find out how to make a Molotov cocktail. And that she had her little children that she was in charge of sneak out of the ghetto, get bottles and bring them back so they could put gas in, and they would experiment with how to make this because they didn't know how. And she told me they were in the basement of a building throwing these half-filled bottles of gas against the back wall of a furnace to try and get them to explode. Well, after much work, they finally got one to explode, and she said they stopped and had a party. They were rejoicing, and it struck me as so bizarre that you have a 17-year-old girl who is celebrating the fact that she now has a weapon, that she's going to go out and fight the Germans who are coming the next day into the ghetto, and perhaps throw it at a tank or something. And there were several tanks destroyed. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising lasted longer than the Polish resistance of the Polish army. So as the Jews were being killed, her husband told me the story of Easter in the ghetto. He was hiding on the Aryan side, trying to pass as an Aryan, and he said when the ghetto erupted and the fighting started, Jews were, you could see into the ghetto from one side, and Jews were on fire. They were jumping from 10-story buildings to their death and being shot. And he said the Easter services were conducted at a Catholic church right on the other side of the ghetto wall. And part of the celebration was a carousel. And he said they didn't even stop the carousel. People came out of the Easter service, they put their kids on the carousel, people were selling food and so on as the ghetto was erupting, and no one helped the Jews. Just an addition to that, I now have a Polish exchange student, a girl, who was asking me about that, and she told me, I think it was yesterday, that all the Poles helped the Jews. That, you know, the death camps are really exaggerated because all the Poles helped the Jews. Well, you know, that's just not history.
One other issue, if I go back to Janelle, and we have in this country a few people, fortunately not very many, but they are trying to revise history. They're called revisionists. And some of them are in hate groups, of course, and some of them are sympathizers to Hitler and the Nazis. Share a little bit with us, how could they have anyone that would take them serious when all of these British soldiers, American soldiers, and others, and we had our former mayor of our city was one of the liberators, one of the camps in World War II, Ray Stone. We have hundreds and hundreds of thousands of photographs of what happened. But isn't it important to talk about this and document it, because some people actually want to try to pretend it did not happen?
Yes, they do. And as the survivors die off, which is happening rapidly, there won't be anyone who can say, I was there, I saw it, they did this to me. So their argument will actually get stronger. But I think it has to do with the presuppositions you start with. For instance, some of the folks you're talking about, the revisionists, if you took those actual trainloads of documents, which we have, you know, and dumped them on the front lawn, they would still deny it. They would still say, this was a movie set, it's exaggerated. We know that's not true, and I think education is our best chance of doing that, which is why the Jewish Labor Committee, who sponsored this trip, wanted to make sure teachers are informed of this, that the museum exists, that people can actually see the historical evidence.
Janelle Burke.
You have some other things that you wanted to tell us, those 21 things that you learned. What are some of the others?
One of the most fascinating to me was a man named Michael Berenbaum, who is one of the former directors of the Holocaust Museum. And he's known as a good scholar on the subject and spent his life really studying it. Well, I had a chance to speak with him, and I asked him a single question. And it's a troubling theological question. It's called the Theodicy, the problem of evil in the world with a good God. And my question was simply, how do you know that this was wrong? And he got very exasperated with me and immediately said, well, some things are just absolute. And I said, thank you very much, that's the answer I wanted, because it seems to me the pervasive relativity or relativism that we see in the 20th century, in my view, as a result of existentialism and other factors, cannot be brought to the gates of Auschwitz. You can't, it seems to me, go there, look in and say, that's okay. Or if you do, I'm kind of, I don't know what to say to you. Language fails me. So it seems to me that one of the things that this brings up is the very question of evil and where it comes from and if it's real and so on. And it has to be answered affirmatively, in my view.
And where would you suggest people could go to learn more about this subject? What are some of the good books you would recommend, or places to go that people would recognize? Now, of course, not everyone can travel to Europe, so what are some of the places?
There are so many resources available now. 1,000 books a year are published on this subject, and it's growing, not receding. I think because people kind of sense the importance of it. So I think the museum, it's ushmm.org, United States Holocaust Museum.org, is a wonderful resource, and they can direct you to many other sites. If you simply go to Google and type in Holocaust, you'll get more material than you can handle. So there are many resources available.
Our viewers throughout the Pacific Northwest, and fortunately our program goes throughout Canada. We love our Canadian friends also. You do have contact too, because some people might want to call upon your expertise or have you to speak. We have two things I think it's come up on the screen. One is your phone number, and that's 208-676, and what is that?
1667.
1667. And then you have a website, is that?
Right, that's the Coeur d'Alene Charter Academy, and I can be reached there at any time.
So it's www.cdacharter.com, is that correct?
.org.
.org, yeah.
Right.
Where I'm at, I can't hardly see the screen, so let's repeat that website again.
Sure, www.cdacharter.org.
Yes, and so they can get in touch with you that way too. We have about 4 minutes left, and Bill, on this subject, some people would say to us today that there's no more genocide, and that's not true.
That's not true.
So we haven't learned completely from history, have we? We had the problems in Eastern Europe in the 1990s, and there was an attempt to what they call ethnic cleansing, and what's happened between the Bosnia Muslims and the Serbs and all, and we have Sudan, and we have all these issues. So what would you say to particularly Americans of how we once again should not be ignoring this problem?
No, I don't think we should, and that's why Elie Wiesel probably he's sometimes called the voice of the Holocaust, because not only is he a prominent writer, but he speaks out, and he goes to places like Rwanda, Darfur, Sudan, and says, Mr. President, we must do something about this. So you're quite right to bring that up. If we don't learn these lessons, then I think it reflects poorly on us.
I have another philosophical question, and some great minds that I've met have talked about this. Speaking of the whole human race, and there's a struggle between good and evil within the human race. And I have a wonderful friend who's going to be speaking. Actually, he'll have already been here on the Popcorn Forum and Symposium when this airs, but he wrote a book on how people become evil. What is your view on, that's Dr. Waller from Whitworth University, but Dr. James Waller, what's your take on what, and his contention is, too, among other things, is that people in mass will do things they would not do on their own individually.
Yeah, I think that's true. You see it in Huck Finn, you know, where the crowd, the mob gets together and one man stops them. So one of the sayings that I love about the Holocaust is, all that it takes for evil to triumph is for a good man to do nothing. So I think we have to be constantly vigilant, and I think we're all capable of this evil, which is disturbing.
Again, one other quick point, and that is that of all your studies on this, and there's, like you say, it's hard to get your mind around, but what is, if you had to focus on one particular point in all your studies, what would it be about this subject? What's the number one lesson?
For me, that evil is real and must be confronted, must be recognized and must be confronted. It doesn't do us any good to say, well, everything's relative, it's all good and evil mixed. I don't think that holds up after this.
I met a sociologist one time somewhere else, not here. He was called a value-free sociologist, and that won't work in these situations.
No, I don't think so.
Value-free is not meeting your responsibilities, and that's kind of accommodation philosophy that I don't understand. Well, again, Bill Prosser, thank you so much. You have been so informative for 2 weeks. It's, in all the years we've been doing this, one of the most powerful series we've done, and we are grateful to you for taking time to share your knowledge with us.
Thank you, Tony. Janelle, it's my pleasure.
And Janelle, thank you again for your questions. Ladies and gentlemen, I am so convinced that this particular two-part series has been extremely helpful to you, and I know many of you out there have relatives or yourself have been in some way a victim, and we hope that we can turn history around in the future and not have these kind of things happening again. And as we always do in this series, we always turn to another subject the next week. I hope you'll be with us. And until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
Recorded on the campus of North Idaho College, Public Forum is the longest-running in-house college production on PBS. Each episode is pre-recorded live and is an educational outreach from North Idaho College. Please join us at this same time next week for another edition of Public Forum on this public television station.